The desert stretched endlessly in every direction, a sea of dust and rock broken only by scattered mesquite trees and thorny cacti. The sun, relentless and merciless, poured its heat over the land like a smelting furnace, turning the earth into cracked clay and the air into shimmering waves. A lone cowboy moved steadily across that wilderness, the only sign of life in miles of barren emptiness. His figure was tall and lean, hardened by years beneath the open sky, and beside him walked a horse's last companion in a world that had taken nearly everything else from him. His name was Caleb Turner, though most men who had known him once were gone, and those who remained would barely remember. Caleb had been a rancher once. With a small spread near the Pecos River, he'd built it with his own hands, fence post by fence post, dreaming of a family that would one day work the land beside him. But dreams had a cruel way of withering under the Texas sun. A drought had burned the grass to ash, leaving his cattle to starve, and raiders had taken what little stock remained. His homestead stood abandoned now, nothing more than a skeleton of broken boards and memories. All that remained of his old life was the horse walking beside him, a bay gelding, scarred and weathered like his master, its ribs showing beneath a coat dulled by dust. Caleb called him Rust, because his color reminded him of iron left too long in the rain. They had been together for 7 years, through storms, stampedes, and lonely trails, and, though Caleb had nothing left to his name, he still had Rust. In truth, the horse was more than property. It was survival. Without it, there was no way to carry water, no way to outrun danger, no way to live. Yet survival had become a strange, empty thing for Caleb. Each morning he rose, with no destination beyond the horizon, no promise waiting at the end of the trail. He was not a man fleeing the law, nor a drifter chasing gold. He was simply moving because stopping meant surrendering to despair. The land had taken his home. Time had taken his family. But as long as he walked with Rust, he wasn't completely alone. That morning, Caleb paused on a ridge overlooking the valley below. He drew a deep breath, filling his lungs with dry air that tasted of dust. His hat brim shaded, his piercing gray eyes that carried the weight of miles and years. He squatted in the dirt, brushing a calloused hand over the faint trail his boots had cut behind him. "We're still here, boy," he murmured to Rust, his voice low and gravelly. The horse flicked its ears and nudged him gently, as though to remind him that even in emptiness, loyalty endured. Caleb's canteen sloshed faintly when he lifted it, and he measured the sound carefully. 2, maybe 3 swallows left. He hadn't found water since the last spring 2 days back, and though he knew the land well enough, the desert wasn't forgiving. A wrong turn could mean death, not just for him, but for Rust as well. He patted the gelding's neck. "We'll find some. Got it." But even as he said it, his throat ached with thirst. As the sun climbed higher, Caleb pressed onward, his boots sinking into hot sand. Every step echoed in silence, broken only by the creak of saddle leather and the occasional call of a vulture circling high above. His shadow stretched long and thin across the ground, a reminder that he was only a small figure against the vastness of the frontier. Still, he moved forward, because that was all a man could do. Despite the hardships, there was still a kind of quiet dignity in his stride. Caleb was a man who had been tested, stripped of comfort and companionship, yet he had not been broken. He carried with him the stubborn resilience of the West itself, barren at times, unforgiving, but still alive beneath the surface. And though he would never say it aloud, a part of him still hoped. Hoped that somewhere beyond the next ridge, the next canyon, the next stretch of wasteland, there was more than just survival waiting. But for now, it was just him and Rust, moving across a desert that seemed endless. The cowboy and his last horse, bound together not just by need, but by loyalty forged in hardship. Neither of them knew that before another sun had set, their lives would change forever, that the choice Caleb would soon make, to surrender the very horse that kept him alive, would open the door to a gift greater than anything he had ever dreamed. The sun was leaning westward when Caleb first heard it. At first he thought it was the wind whispering through the canyon rocks, the way desert air sometimes carried a low, ghostly moan. But when he stopped and tilted his head, the sound came again, faint, broken, and unmistakably human. A cry, weak, desperate. Caleb's hand dropped instinctively to the worn handle of his Colt revolver. Out here, in no man's land, a man couldn't afford to ignore strange sounds. The cry might belong to someone in need, but it might also be bait and ambush trick used by outlaws or hostile raiders. Still, the sound wasn't steady. It carried pain, not malice, like someone calling from the edge of life itself. Russ snorted, uneasily, tossing his head, ears swiveling toward the canyon. Caleb laid a calming hand on the horse's neck. "Easy, boy. We'll see what this is about." His voice was low, steady, but his pulse had quickened. He guided Rust off the faint trail, boots crunching against gravel as they descended into the canyon's shadows. The further they went, the clearer the sound became. It was a woman's voice, trembling, gasping for breath. Caleb rounded a cluster of jagged rocks, and his eyes narrowed at the sight before him. There, half hidden beneath a scraggly mesquite bush, lay a young Apache woman. Her dark hair was tangled with dust, her face pale beneath streaks of blood. Her right leg was twisted at an odd angle, and her shoulder bore an ugly wound, as if from a rifle shot that had grazed deep. Her chest rose and fell shallowly, each breath a struggle. Her eyes, dark as obsidian, fluttered open at the sound of his approach, and in them burned both fear and defiance. The moment she saw him, his hat, his boots, the revolver at his side, her hand darted to a knife at her belt. She tried to lift it, but the effort cost her what little strength she had. The blade slipped from her fingers and clattered against the stone. Caleb froze, raising his empty hand slowly. "Easy now. I ain't here to hurt you." Her lips moved, whispering words in Apache he didn't understand. Her voice cracked, then shifted into broken English water. "Please." The cowboy's throat tightened. He glanced at his canteen. Only a few swallows left, barely enough for him and Rust to last until he found the next spring. Without water, he'd be as good as dead. Yet here lay a woman who was already closer to death than him. For a moment, the desert itself seemed to hold its breath, as though watching his choice. Caleb's jaw clenched. He uncapped the canteen, kneeling beside her. "Don't drink too fast," he murmured, tilting it carefully to her lips. She drank greedily, water trickling down her chin, then coughed but managed to swallow more. Her eyes, still sharp with suspicion, softened slightly. Caleb studied her wounds. The leg was badly broken. She wouldn't be walking anytime soon. The shoulder wound was crusted with dried blood. If fever hadn't set in yet, it would soon. Alone, she wouldn't survive the night. His gaze drifted to Rust. The horse carried all his supplies, the saddle, the rifle, the few belongings he had left. More importantly, Rust was his way out of this desert. Without him, Caleb's chances of finding water before his canteen ran dry were slim. He knew it. The horse was survival. And yet, when he looked back at the woman, he saw more than just a wounded stranger. He saw the sheer will in her eyes, the way she clung to life despite pain and fear. She was young, barely more than 20, he guessed, and though her people and his were caught in the endless conflict of the frontier, she was still just a human being, fighting to live. Caleb let out a slow breath. He could ride away. No one would know. No one would blame him. But his gut twisted at the thought. Walking away meant leaving her to die in the dust. And he couldn't carry that weight, not on top of all the others he already bore. He stepped back, his decision settling like iron in his chest. "You'll ride," he said, his voice quiet but certain. She blinked, not understanding at first. Then he lifted her gently, ignoring her weak protests. Sand set her across Rust's back. The horse shifted under her slight weight, but Caleb soothed him with a pat. The woman looked down at him, confusion flickering in her weary eyes. "Why?" she whispered. Caleb adjusted the reins, preparing to lead the horse on foot. He gave her a faint, tired smile. "Because you need him more than I do." The desert sun dipped lower, painting the rocks with firelight. And with that single act surrendering the only thing keeping him alive, Caleb Turner's fate veered onto a new trail, one neither he nor the wounded Apache woman could have imagined. Caleb's boots crunched against the gravelly sand as he took the first step, leading Rust with the wounded Apache woman slumped across the saddle. Each footfall seemed heavier than the last, not because of the trail ahead, but because of what it meant. He had given up the one thing that had kept him alive through years of hard travel. Every survival lesson a cowboy ever learned told him the same truth. A man without a horse in the desert was as good as dead. Rust had been more than a mount. He was speed if trouble came, muscled to carry water, and the only sure way to escape this unforgiving wilderness. Without him, Caleb was nothing but a weary man with dust in his lungs and the sun at his back. But when he glanced at the woman resting weakly on Rust's back, he knew he couldn't have chosen differently. Her face was pale, her breaths shallow, and every so often her lips moved with words he couldn't understand, perhaps prayers in her native tongue. She wasn't just hurt, she was teetering between life and death. Without the horse, she never would have stood a chance. Still, the weight of his choice pressed on him. "Lord," he muttered under his breath, "I must be out of my mind." The trail wound deeper into the canyon, where shadows stretched long and cool. Caleb was grateful. For that much, the shade eased the heat, beating down on them. But the relief was short-lived. His throat ached, dry as leather, and every time he touched his canteen at his hip, he remembered how light it was. Water. That was the next problem. Rust snorted behind him, adjusting to the uneven rhythm of carrying a rider too weak to hold herself steady. Caleb slowed his pace, steadying the reins to keep her from slipping. She stirred faintly, her dark eyes flicking open just enough to catch him watching her. For a heartbeat, their gazes held. "You," she whispered, her voice a thread of sound. "Why help?" Caleb's mouth tugged into something between a grimace and a smile. "Guess I'm too stubborn to leave folks behind." Her eyes closed again. but not before he caught the faintest flicker of disbelief, maybe even gratitude, cross her face. The trail bent, opening into a flat stretch of desert plain. Here, the canyon's protection gave way, and the sun blazed down mercilessly. Caleb shaded his eyes with one hand, scanning the horizon for anything, a line of cottonwoods, a dark cut in the earth, any sign of water. Nothing, just the endless mirage of heat, shimmer, and stone. Russ blew out a tired breath, his ears twitching. Caleb gave his neck a pat. Easy, boy, I know. You're thirsty, same as me. The choice clawed at him again, rising like a devil's whisper. You could take the horse back. She wouldn't last anyway. One man can live. Two can't. He shut the thought down as quick as it came. Caleb Turner wasn't the kind of man to weigh a life like a sack of grain. His mama had raised him better, and no amount of dust or despair was going to change that. The woman stirred again, murmuring something in Apache. Caleb couldn't understand the words, but her tone was pleading. Her hand slipped toward her wound. As though to shield it, Caleb walked closer, steadying her before she toppled from the saddle. Don't worry, he said softly, his voice rough but steady. I'll get you where you need to go. The strange thing was, he didn't even know where that was. An Apache village, a hidden camp. If they found themselves wandering blind, they'd both be done for. But for now, he focused on each step, one after another, as though sheer will might carve a path where none seemed to exist. Hours dragged, Caleb's legs burned from the endless walk, and sweat stung his eyes. He tried not to think about the water left in the canteen. Just a sip remained, and soon even that would be gone. The desert tested him with each breath, each stretch of horizon. That promised relief and gave none. Yet every time he faltered, his eyes went to the woman. She was someone's daughter, maybe someone's sister, someone's kin, who prayed she was still alive. Caleb clenched his jaw. If he had to crawl, he'd get her through this. Finally, as the sun kissed the western rim of the sky, he spotted it, a thin ribbon of green against the barren brown cottonwoods. A dry smile tugged at his lips. Water, he whispered. There's gotta be. Hope sparked in his chest. For the first time that day, his stride quickened. Behind him, Russ plodded faithfully, the woman still draped across his back. Caleb realized then that his decision, desperate though it had been, wasn't just about saving her. It was about saving himself, too, not his body, but what was left of his soul. Because a man who left another to die might go on breathing, but he wasn't really living. The grove of cottonwoods was a blessing, but not the miracle Caleb had prayed for. Yes, there was water, though it was only a shallow seep pooled in a muddy basin, more fit for cattle than people. Still, water was water. Russ lowered his muzzle eagerly, lapping at it, while Caleb filled his canteen with hands shaking from exhaustion. He let the Apache woman drink slowly, holding the canteen steady at her lips. Her eyes fluttered open, dark and wary, but for the first time since he'd found her, he thought he saw a spark of life return. After she drank, Caleb rinsed her wounds as best he could. He tore strips from his spare shirt and bound her shoulder tightly, hoping to slow infection. The leg, though he winced when he looked at it, broken bad, bone pressing against skin. Without splints in time, she wouldn't walk for weeks, maybe longer. As dusk fell, he built a small fire, careful to keep the smoke low in case unfriendly eyes prowled the horizon. The desert cooled quickly once the sun was gone, shadows creeping over the land like a tide. He gave the woman a piece of hardtack softened in water, which she chewed slowly, her hands trembling. Caleb sat a little ways off, his back against Rust's saddle, and let the firelight paint his weary face. His muscles ached from walking miles. In the heat, his throat still raw, despite the water. He was bone-tired, but he didn't let himself drift too far into sleep. Out here, sleep could mean a knife in the dark. The woman stirred, whispering something in Apache. Her voice was low, almost like a song, and though he didn't know the words, there was something mournful, almost prayerful, in the sound. Caleb found himself listening, the cadence carrying him somewhere far from the desert, a reminder that she wasn't just a wounded stranger. She was a person, carrying stories, memories, a life of her own. Wish I knew what you were saying, he muttered quietly. Her gaze shifted toward him, tired but sharp. I pray, she said in halting English. She touched her chest weakly. For strength, Caleb nodded slowly. Can't hurt? His voice was gruff, but something about the moment softened the lines of his face. Through the night, he tended the fire and kept watch. Coyotes yipped in the distance, their calls carrying across the plains. Now and then, he caught movement in the shadows, and his hand tightened around the rifle resting across his lap. Every sound felt louder, every shadow deeper. The price of kindness was setting in. His legs burned from walking without a mount. His body longed for rest, yet he forced himself awake to guard a woman who, for all he knew, might not trust him come morning. He had put his life in danger by keeping her, and part of him knew if raiders or soldiers came, he'd be hunted as her ally. But when he looked at her pale face in the glow of the fire, he knew he wouldn't change a thing. By morning, exhaustion weighed heavy. His stomach ached with hunger, and though he shared his rations with her, he knew they wouldn't last long. When he stood, his legs trembled. Walking another day in this desert without a horse would take everything he had left. The Apache woman tried to sit up, gasping with pain, but gestured toward the saddlebag. "Food. For you," she whispered. Caleb shook his head. "You need it more." Her dark eyes locked on his, though weak. Her voice carried iron. "You walk, I ride. You die, I die." For a moment, Caleb was struck silent. She wasn't wrong. His sacrifice had bought her a chance, but if he collapsed, she would be stranded just the same. There was no bargain here where one life could be saved without the other. He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his stubbled jaw. "Reckon we're stuck with each other." Then, a faint smile tugged at her cracked lips. Unexpected, fleeting, but real. It startled him more than the coyotes had. That day, he pressed onward, each step harder than the last. The desert sun rose like a brand in the sky, beating down on his back. His boots filled with grit, his shoulders burned, and every time his body begged to stop, he thought of the woman behind him. She was fragile as glass now, but within her was a will to survive. Somehow, that gave him strength enough to keep moving. The price of kindness was steep as body, his rations, his very chance at survival. But Caleb Turner had always been a stubborn man, and once he gave his word, he didn't take it back. If this desert meant to break him for the choice he made, then so be it. He squared his shoulders against the horizon and walked on, leading Rust carefully, the Apache woman watching silently from the saddle. And though the desert demanded everything, it hadn't yet taken hope. By the third day, Caleb's body felt as though it had been carved from lead. His legs trembled with each step, his shoulders burned from the weight of the rifle and gear, and the blisters in his boots had torn open into raw wounds. Still, he pressed forward, Rust plodding behind him with the Apache woman resting weakly in the saddle. The sun was merciless. But something else pressed on Caleb's mind, something colder than thirst, heavier than exhaustion. He felt it first as a prickle between his shoulder blades, the kind a man gets when he knows he's being watched. He tried to shake it off, telling himself it was only the desert playing tricks. But when he scanned the horizon, he spotted what he feared: distant figures on horseback, tiny silhouettes etched against the ridges. He stopped in his tracks, his breath catching. The woman stirred, lifting her head weakly. Her gaze followed his, and when she saw the riders, her eyes widened with alarm. She spoke quickly in Apache, her words urgent. "I don't understand," Caleb said, steadying her before she slid from the saddle, "but I can guess." She gripped his arm, mustering her strength to whisper in broken English. "Not my people, enemy." Caleb cursed under his breath. That settled it. Whoever they weren't friendly, and if they were tracking her, they wouldn't rest until they found her. He led Rust off the open trail, guiding them into a stretch of scrubland broken by sandstone ridges. The ground grew treacherous, littered with loose rock and thorny brush, but it offered cover. Each time Caleb glanced back, the riders were closer, their shapes clearer: 6, maybe 7 men, moving with the patience of hunters who knew their prey was tiring. "Damn," Caleb muttered. His jaw tightened. He was already walking on fumes, but if he slowed now, they'd be run down before nightfall. The woman leaned toward him, her voice hoarse. "They want me dead." Caleb gave her a sharp look. "Why?" Her eyes flickered with pain and something heavier: guilt, perhaps. "I carry words. Message, for my father, the chief." She pressed a trembling hand against her chest. "They knew. They tried to stop." Caleb swallowed hard. So this wasn't just a wounded stranger he'd stumbled upon. This was a chief's daughter, carrying something important enough to kill. For he let out a low whistle. "And here I thought I was just saving a life. Turns out, I stepped into a war." Her lips pressed together in a faint, grim smile. "You regret?" He shook his head, though the weight of his choice settled heavier on his shoulders. "No, just means we've got to be smarter about staying alive." By late afternoon, the riders had vanished from sight, swallowed by the rolling desert. But Caleb knew better than to think they'd given up. Men like that didn't abandon a hunt. They circled, closed in like wolves, waiting for the right moment to strike. As the sky bled into dusk, Caleb found shelter in a narrow ravine. He built no fire that night. The cold bit at them, but firelight would have been an invitation. Instead, they huddled in the dark, Rust tethered close, the woman wrapped in Caleb's spare blanket. Caleb sat with his rifle across his knees, every nerve straining for sound. Coyotes yipped in the distance. Owls hooted from the cliff's butt. Beneath those wild voices, he swore he heard the faint clatter of hooves, distant but deliberate. He pictured the riders fanning out across the desert, waiting for moonlight to betray him. Beside him, the woman whispered something in Apache. He turned his head toward her. "What's that mean?" She hesitated, then said, "I ask spirits to guide you." Caleb gave a tired chuckle. "I'll take all the guiding I can get." Silence settled again. In the faint starlight, he studied her face, gaunt from hunger, pale from blood loss, yet unbroken. There was steel in her, a fire that refused to die out, and he wondered if that same fire was what had made her enemies hunt her so fiercely. At some point in the night, exhaustion overtook him. He drifted in and out, jerking awake each time a rock shifted or Rust stirred. but morning brought no attack. When dawn painted the sky pink and gold, Caleb rose stiffly. Stretching the ache from his limbs, the woman looked at him, her voice faint, but firm. They follow still. Caleb nodded. I know. He tightened the cinch on Rust's saddle and slung his rifle across his back. But as long as I'm breathing, they won't take you. And with that vow, he led them out of the ravine toward another day of desert and danger. Somewhere behind them, hidden in the ridges, the shadows of pursuit waited, patient and deadly. Caleb knew one truth better than any other. The desert tested a man's strength. But it was people who tested his soul. The pursuit did not end by day. Caleb pushed himself harder than his body could stand, leading Rust through gullies, over ridges, and across dry creek beds to throw off the rider's trail. By night, when the desert cooled and silence stretched wide, the two of them, man and woman, huddled close to a low fire, nursing wounds that were more than just physical. It was during those nights that the healing began. The Apache woman, whose name Caleb finally learned was Ayanna, was too weak to do much at first. She spoke little, her English broken, her words scattered like pebbles across the sand. But her eyes never stopped watching, never stopped learning him. She studied the way he tended the fire, the way he leaned against Rust with weary affection, the way he scanned the horizon even when he should have been resting. Caleb, for his part, was surprised at how quickly she grew less a stranger and more something else. He had saved people before cowhands and stampedes, neighbors caught in storms, but never had he felt the strange pull he did with Ayanna. Maybe it was the way her spirit burned through the pain, or maybe it was the way she spoke with a kind of quiet strength that reminded him of someone he used to know, his mother, perhaps, who had never bent, even when life had broken everything else around her. One night, beneath a canopy of stars, Caleb carefully rewrapped the bandages on her shoulder. She hissed at the sting but didn't pull away. His hands, rough from rope and rain, were surprisingly gentle. You're healing, he said after a moment, his voice gravelly from thirst and long silence. She gave the faintest nod. Because you help. Caleb leaned back on his heels, shaking his head. Because you're stubborn enough not to die on me. Her lips curved just slightly, but enough to startle him. A smile, the first he'd seen on her. That same night, she gestured to the sky, pointing at a cluster of stars shining bright above the desert. She spoke in Apache, then tried again in English. Coyote, she said, tracing the outline with her finger. Trickster. Caleb followed her hand, frowning. Doesn't look like much of a coyote to me. She shook her head. Not what you see. What you remember. He considered that, then chuckled softly. I reckon most of my life don't look like much either, but I remember the good parts. Her dark eyes flicked toward him, curious. Good parts. Caleb hesitated, the memories pressing against a wall he hadn't opened in years. Had a ranch once. Cattle, horses, land by the river. He paused, his voice thickening. Had a wife too. She's gone now. Fever took her. Silence stretched. Between them, broken only by the crackle of fire, Ayanna reached out, her hand trembling but sure, and touched his arm lightly. You carry her still, she said simply. Caleb swallowed hard, unable to answer, but in her words, he felt something lift, a burden shared, even if just a little. The nights went on like that, each one drawing them closer. Ayanna, though wounded, gave back in small ways. She showed him how to spot signs of water in the land, way insects moved at dusk, the shape of plants whose roots tapped hidden springs. She taught him a few Apache words to for water, si for me, ni for you. He repeated them with his rough drawl, and though his tongue stumbled, she laughed softly when he got them wrong. In turn, Caleb shared with her pieces of his world. He told her about the trail drives he'd ridden, the storms that nearly drowned men and cattle alike, the long nights where the only sound was a harmonica played by some boy dreaming of home. He even showed her how to clean his revolver, her eyes sharp as she studied each movement. Trust grew slowly, like embers catching in dry grass. At first, it was only necessity, they needed each other to survive. But as the days bled into nights, and the nights bled into days, it became something deeper. One evening, after she'd eaten the last strip of jerky he dared spare, Ayanna fixed her gaze on him. You give much, she said. Horse, water, food. Why? Caleb stared into the fire, its glow painting his face in shades of golden shadow. Finally he answered, his voice low. Because I reckon a man's got to stand for something. Otherwise he ain't worth a damn. Ayanna studied him a long moment, then nodded slowly. Then, you worth much. Her words sank into him like rain into parched earth. He looked away, uncomfortable with the warmth that stirred in his chest. A warmth he hadn't felt in years. And so the nights of healing passed, not just for her broken body, but for his weary soul. In the firelight and silence of the desert, two lives, scarred by loss, began to stitch together, one fragile thread at a time. By the time the seventh night fell over the desert, Caleb Turner was running on little more than grit and stubbornness. His boots were worn through, his canteen nearly empty again, and his body screamed at every step. He had given his horse to Ayanna, had given her food and water he could barely spare, and though she was slowly mending, he himself was unraveling. Yet it was that very unraveling that began to shift something between them. Ayanna could see it. She had the sharp eyes of someone raised to read every sign of weakness in the wild. The way Caleb's shoulders sagged when he thought she wasn't looking, the tremor in his hands when he lifted the rifle, the way his lips were cracked with thirst. She understood then that the scales of sacrifice were unbalanced. He had carried her this far, but he could not carry them both forever. The following morning, as the sun rose pale over the horizon, Ayanna stirred from where she had slept against Rust's saddle. "Stop," she said quietly, when Caleb reached for the reins. He frowned. "We can't stop. They're still behind us." She shook her head. "Not stop walking. Stop giving all. You die, I die." Caleb let out a dry laugh, one without humor. "You think I don't know that?" She held his gaze steadily, then pushed herself upright despite the pain. Her broken leg was still bound in splints he'd fashioned, but she could sit straighter now, her strength returning. "Then let me help." He opened his mouth to argue, but she cut him off, pointing to the land around them. "This desert is my home. I know it. You do not." It was true. Caleb was no stranger to the wilderness, but he was an outsider here. He saw only sand, scrub, and stone, where she saw signs and secrets. That day, she guided him. From Rust's back, her eyes scanned the ground until she pointed at a cluster of wiry plants, half hidden among the rocks. Caleb followed her direction, digging at the roots until he found damp bulbs swollen with water. They were bitter when chewed, but they eased the thirst clawing at his throat. Later, she told him to watch the flight of birds circling low to the east. "There," she said, her voice gaining strength. "Water." Sure enough, they found a shallow spring hidden among reeds, when Caleb would have walked past without a second thought. Each time she led him true, Caleb's respect for her deepened. She was no helpless burden. She was teaching him how to see the desert with new eyes. That night, as they shared the meager meal he'd scraped together from his pack, she pressed her hand lightly to her chest. "Trust," she said. "I give to you." He tilted his head, studying her. "You mean you trust me?" She nodded, then hesitated. "Not easy. Your people bring pain. Take much." Her eyes flickered with shadows of memory. Caleb said nothing for a long moment. He couldn't deny her words. He had seen settlers drive out tribes, soldiers burn villages, greed crush lives. He had no defense. All he could offer was his own truth. "I ain't like every man wearing boots and spurs. I just do what I can to live decent." Ayanna studied him, then gave the smallest nod, as though that was enough. The trust between them grew in small ways after that. When Caleb's knees buckled on a steep climb, she reached down and gripped his arm, helping steady him. When his blistered feet bled through his socks, she ground desert herbs into a paste, pressing it gently to the wounds. Each act was quiet, wordless, but it carried weight. For Caleb, it was strange to be on the receiving end of care. He was used to carrying burdens alone, used to giving and expecting nothing back. Yet here was this woman, wounded and hunted, giving him the gift of trust, choosing to believe in him when she had every reason not to. One evening, as they rested in a shallow canyon, Ayanna turned her face toward him. "When I heal," she said slowly, "I will walk, not just ride." We walked together. Her words struck him more deeply than he expected. It wasn't just a promise of shared burden, it was a promise of companionship. Caleb tipped his hat low, trying to hide the flicker of emotion in his eyes. "Reckon I'd like that," he said softly. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he didn't feel like a man walking alone. The desert was still vast, the danger still close behind, but trust had changed the shape of the journey. Where before there had been only sacrifice, now there was partnership, and in that partnership, Caleb felt a strength returning, one he hadn't known he'd lost. The desert narrowed into a winding pass of red stone, its walls rising high and jagged on either side. Caleb Turner knew the place was a choke point, a dangerous stretch where a man could be trapped with nowhere to run. As he studied the canyon's entrance, his gut twisted. The tracks he'd been reading all morning told him the truth. They were being followed, and their pursuers were closing in. Rust shifted nervously under Ayanna, ears flicking. She felt it too. Her dark eyes scanned the ridges above them. "They wait," she whispered. Caleb tightened his grip on the rifle slung across his chest. "Yeah," he muttered. "I figured." He could see the exhaustion on her face, though she tried to hide it. Her wounds still slowed her. Even with her guidance, even with the trust they had built, there was no way she could defend herself if a fight broke out. And he had one rifle, a handful of bullets, and his own battered body. Still, he set his jaw. He had made his choice days ago when he put her on his horse. He wasn't about to let that choice go to waste. "Now, stay low," he told her, guiding Rust toward the canyon. "No matter what happens, don't stop." Ayanna frowned, sensing something in his tone. "What will you do?" He gave her a grim smile. "Buy us some time." The canyon walls closed in, shadow falling heavy over the path. For a moment, all was still. Then, a sharp whistle pierced the silence, and figures emerged from the rocks. 3 men, rifles glinting in the fading sun. Caleb's blood ran cold. He recognized their look. mercenaries, bounty hunters, the kind who hunted Apache for pay or vengeance. One of them sneered when he saw Caleb. Well, didn't figure we'd find a white man keeping company with a redskin. You hand her over, cowboy, and maybe we let you walk out. Caleb stepped forward, rifle in hand, planting himself between Ayanna and the men. Ain't gonna happen. The sneer twisted into a snarl. Then you'll die with her. The first shot rang out, echoing like thunder in the canyon. Caleb dropped low, returning fire. Dust exploded from the rock beside him as bullets chipped away his cover. His heart pounded, every instinct screaming at him to run, but he stayed, because, behind him, Ayanna clutched the reins and prayed under her breath. Go! He shouted, waving his hand. Ride, Ayanna, ride now. She hesitated, torn, but then with a cry to rest, she urged the horse forward. The gelding bolted hooves, striking sparks on the stone as they charged deeper into the canyon. The pursuers cursed, firing after her, but Caleb drew their attention with a well-placed shot that clipped the hat from one man's head. They turned on him in fury. Caleb ducked, firing again, then rolled behind another outcrop of stone. His body ached with every movement, but adrenaline kept him sharp. He fired, reloaded, fired again, holding them off inch by inch. One man fell, clutching his arm. The others pressed harder. Caleb knew he couldn't hold forever. His bullets were running low, and then, above him, a sound Ayanna's voice. She had circled back, guiding Rust along a ledge above the canyon. She held Caleb's spare rifle, the one he'd lashed to the saddle. Though weak, she steadied the weapon with determination. Down, she shouted. Caleb dropped flat just as her shot rang out. One of the pursuers staggered and collapsed. Shock jolted through Caleb. She could barely stand days ago, and now she was fighting beside him. With their numbers thinned, the last man broke. He spat a curse, fired a final shot wide, then scrambled back into the rocks. Retreating, silence fell, broken only by Caleb's ragged breathing. He slowly pushed himself up, brushing dust from his face. His eyes found Ayanna, above, rifle still in hand, her chest rising and falling with the effort. For a long moment, they just stared at each other, the weight of what had just happened hanging heavy between them. Then she guided Rust down the slope toward him. When she reached him, she slid from the saddle despite the pain in her leg. Her hands trembled as she set the rifle aside. You fight for me, she said softly. Now I fight for you. Caleb swallowed hard, emotion rising thick in his throat. He tipped his hat low, unable to meet her gaze, for fear she'd see too much in his eyes. Reckon we make a good team, he muttered. She touched his arm, firm and steady. Together, she said. And in that canyon of red stone, where death had nearly claimed them both, Caleb realized the truth. He hadn't just saved her life, she had saved his, too. Not only from bullets, but from the loneliness that had haunted him for years. The final crossing wasn't just through was into something new, something fragile and powerful. A bond forged in sacrifice and fire. The sun had barely risen when the canyon gave way to a vast stretch of mesa land, its edges softened by morning mist. Caleb trudged behind Rust, his legs heavy, his boots scuffed and torn. Ayanna sat tall in the saddle despite the fading strength. In her limbs, her dark braids loose around her shoulders. The sight of her guiding him forward gave Caleb the strength to keep putting one foot in front of the other. By noon, the mesas broke into a hidden valley, green and alive against the barren desert. Caleb stopped, staring in disbelief. After days of endless dust and parched earth, the sudden sight of running water, cornfields, and smoke curling from lodges seemed like a dream. Ayanna turned, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Home, she whispered. Caleb exhaled slowly, his heart lifting. He had gotten her here against all odds, through pursuit, bullets, and the desert's cruelty. But as they descended into the valley, he realized the journey wasn't truly over. Not yet. The village stirred as they approached. Men armed with bows and spears emerged, wary eyes fixed on the stranger walking at Ayanna's side. Mothers pulled children back, and whispers rippled through the camp. Caleb could feel their suspicion like a weight pressing down on him. Ayanna raised her hand in a gesture of peace. It is I, Ayanna, daughter of Chief Dakota, she called in her native tongue. The relief in her voice cracked through the air. Like thunder, the guards froze, then broke into cries of recognition. Ayanna. In moments, the village erupted in movement. People rushed forward, tears streaming down faces as they welcomed their chief's daughter. But as they embraced her, their gazes cut sharply toward Caleb. He stood apart, hands loosely at his sides, rifle slung but pointed down, showing no threat. Still, he could feel their distrust like knives at his back. Then the crowd parted, and a tall man stepped forward. His hair was streaked with silver, his eyes sharp and deep as obsidian. His presence alone stilled the murmurs. Father, Ayanna whispered, sliding from Rust's back, though pain lanced through her body. She nearly fell, but Caleb caught her before she hit the ground. Together, they stood before the elder. Chief, Tokuda's gaze swept from his daughter to the weathered cowboy, holding her steady. The silence stretched, heavy and thick. Then, with surprising gentleness, the chief cupped Ayanna's face in his hands. You are alive, he said, voice deep and steady. I am alive, she replied, her eyes glistening. She gestured toward Caleb. Because of him, every eye in the village turned. Caleb shifted uncomfortably, tipping his hat. Didn't do nothing special, he muttered. Just couldn't leave her behind. The chief's brows furrowed. You gave her your horse. Caleb hesitated, then nodded. It was all I had left. Didn't seem right keeping it. Well, she couldn't walk. A hush fell over the gathering. Among the Apache, a horse was more than an animal. It was wealth, freedom, and life itself. To give up one's last horse was a sacrifice beyond measure. The chief studied him for a long moment, then spoke words Caleb did not understand. Ayanna translated softly. He says a man who gives up his last horse for another has given more than gold. He has given his spirit. Caleb's throat tightened. He wasn't a man used to praise, and the weight of those words struck deep. The chief nodded slowly, then extended his arm. Tentatively, Caleb grasped it. The clasp of warriors, of equals. The crowd murmured approval, the distrust easing into cautious respect. That evening, the tribe held a feast in Ayanna's honor. Fires blazed high, and songs carried into the night. Caleb sat near the flames, a plate of roasted venison before him. Though he hardly touched it, he felt out of place, a wanderer in a world not his own. Yet, when Ayanna approached and sat beside him, offering him a cup of sweet corn drink, the unease in his chest softened. You are no longer alone, Caleb Turner, she said, her voice steady. My people see your sacrifice. My father sees your heart. You are welcome here. Caleb swallowed hard, staring into the fire. For years he had drifted like dust on the wind, belonging nowhere, wanted by no one. Now, sitting among people who had once eyed him with suspicion, he felt the faint stirrings of something he thought he had lost forever. Belonging. The chief rose, lifting his hands to the sky. His voice carried over the valley. This man gave his last horse to save my daughter. Tonight, he is our guest. Tomorrow, he may choose if he will walk on Alinor, if he will walk with us. Caleb's heart hammered. For the first time in years, the choice before him was not about survival, but about life, real life, with purpose and connection. And as Ayanna's hand brushed against his, steady and warm, he realized that perhaps he already knew his answer. The night fires burned low, casting long glowing shadows across the Apache camp. Caleb sat a little apart, the crackle of flames and the rhythm of drum beats echoing in his chest. For the first time in many years, he wasn't thinking about where he would wander next or how he would scrape by come morning. Instead, he was thinking about belonging. He'd expected to feel like an outsider forever, even after the feast in his honor. Yet the people had welcomed him with cautious kindness, offering food, blankets, and quiet nods of respect. Ayanna's father, Chief Tokata, had spoken words that still rang in Caleb's mind. A man who gives his last horse gives more than his life, he gives his heart. Caleb had given his last horse, and now, it seemed, he had gained something immeasurable in return, but the truest gift had not yet been revealed. At dawn, a soft hand touched his shoulder. Caleb stirred awake from where he had dozed beside the fire. Ayanna stood before him, wrapped in a deerskin cloak, her dark hair catching the first light of morning. Her eyes, deep and steady, held his in silence for a long moment before she spoke. Walk with me, she said softly. He rose, stretching his sore limbs, and followed her out of the camp. The village was just waking, smoke rising from small cook fires, the sound of children laughing faintly in the distance. They walked beyond the lodges, toward the edge of the valley, where the earth opened into wide prairie. When they stopped, Ayanna turned to him. You gave me your horse when you had nothing else, she said, and you did it without asking for anything in return. Caleb shrugged, his voice low. Couldn't just leave you to die, Ayanna. Don't sit right with a man to turn his back when someone's fighting for their life. Her lips curved into the smallest of smiles. Perhaps, but to us, it was more. My people believe the horse carries the spirit of freedom. When you gave me yours, you gave me the will to live. And in doing so, you gave me back to my father, to my people. Caleb looked away, embarrassed by the weight of her gratitude. Truth is, I didn't think I had much left to give. Guess I was wrong. You were not wrong, she said firmly, because the greatest gifts are not measured in what a man owns, but in what he is willing to surrender. Her words cut straight through him. For years, he had measured his worth by the land he'd lost, the horse he still had, and the emptiness that followed him. But now, he saw it clearly. The worth of a man was not in what he held on to, but in what he was willing to give away for another's sake. Ayanna stepped closer, her hand brushing his arm. My gift to you is not food or shelter. It is not even my people's protection, though you have that too. She looked into his eyes, steady and unflinching. My gift to you is a place to belong. If you wish it, Caleb Turner, you will never walk alone again. Caleb's throat tightened. He had faced bullets, hunger, and the burning desert without flinching, but now he found himself struggling to speak. You'd have me stay, a white man among your people. Ayanna nodded. My father has already spoken. You are welcome. You saved the daughter of a chief, but more than that, you showed a heart. My people understand. Blood is not the only bond. Spirit is stronger. Her words sank deep, rooting in the empty places of his soul. For so long, Caleb had drifted, like tumbleweed, a man with no ties, no family, no home. Now, for the first time, he felt the pull of belonging, and it frightened him almost as much as it healed him. He looked at her, at the strength in her dark eyes, the trust she placed in him so freely, and he realized the truth her gift was not only belonging, not only trust, it was herself. Ayanna, his voice cracked, but he pressed on. I ain't never been a man of many words, but I reckon if you'll have me, I'd stay. I'd stand by your people, by you. Her hand slipped into his, warm and sure. Then it is settled. When they returned to the village, hand in hand, the people understood without words. The cowboy, who had given his last horse, had gained something greater than he ever imagined. A family, a future, and a love that no drought or dust storm could take away. And as Caleb looked around the valley, the smoke of morning fires rising into the clear sky, he knew one thing with certainty. The gift Ayanna had given him would last forever. Not just a place to belong, not just love, but a life worth living again.